That is the question. What did happen? Well, we know the Russians are bombing non-ISIS targets in their effort to kill off ISIS and backstop Bashar Assad in Syria. But there's also unbelievable chaos breaking out, and it's looking real bad in Afghanistan. I want to bring in one of my favorite experts on both these topics, Bill Raggio from the longwarjournal.org. He's also with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and you can find out more about that group at defenddemocracy.org. Bill Raggio, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Brent. Always a pleasure.
All right, so listen, right out of the box, we start watching the news this morning, and we find out the Russians are running military operations in Syria, ostensibly to take out ISIS, except they're bombing in everywhere but ISIS territory. They're hitting regular old resistance fighters and Syrian resistance territory. What's going on here? What's the buzz you're hearing coming out of Syria?
Well, they're basically taking a page out of the Turkish playbook, where the Turks said, hey, we're going to get involved in the war and we're going to attack ISIS, and then immediately they turn on the PKK, which is a Kurdish terrorist group that operates in Syria, Iraq, and southern Turkey. So the Russians, I think, are doing a bit of the same. I haven't seen what they've actually targeted yet, but what I'm guessing that they're doing is they're probably going after a lot of these fighters from the Caucasus. Mm-hmm. Those pose a direct threat to the Russians. And additionally, it puts it makes things difficult for the U.S. to conduct air operations inside of Syria. When those skies start getting full, mm-hmm. You have the chance of going head to head, and the last thing the U.S. and Russia wants to do is, pit their air forces against each other while they're in Russia. And I think that could be part of the plan to stymie whatever the U.S. air campaign. The Russians, the Islamic State isn't any big threat to them.
Right.
If they're not going to come into this fight, and just because of the Islamic State, they want to preserve the Assad regime, so they're going to hit the targets that the Assad regime thinks are most important.
So we know that they've constructed this intel gathering kind of network that they've put together between the Syrian government, the Iranian government, and the Iraqi government, such as it is. Could you envision a scenario wherein there's actually Syrian fighters in the sky, Russian fighters in the sky, Iranian fighters in the sky, and Iraqi fighters in the sky, plus the Americans over Syria?
I certainly would guess it's possible. I mean, I don't think the U.S. is likely to conduct air operations with the Iranians and Syrians.
But I mean, all kind of running competitively at the same time. I mean, this is going to get crowded pretty quick, man.
Yeah, look, that's how wars can start. So It's not something the U.S. is going to tread very lightly. I don't think the Russians would care about putting their fighters. As a matter of fact, they put their fighters up in the skies today, really without any coordination with the U.S., which has been launching an air campaign since August of 2014. So there's clearly very little consideration from the Russians of what's on the U.S. side of the equation. But in the U.S. side of this, the U.S. leadership is not going to want to risk shooting down a Russian plane.
And the Iraqis, just for the record, they're flying our hardware, right?
That's right. It gets awfully confusing.
Oh, God, this is horrible,
Syrians are flying Russian hardware, and the Russians are flying theirs.
Tell me what the IFF picture is going to be like when they're hitting each other on the radar, man, because you're going to have no idea what you're dealing with.
Exactly.
All right. So we know that this is going to be chaotic for some time to come. My bet that I laid down earlier today was Bill Raggio, that you would see a scenario where the Russians will just start bombing ISIS tomorrow just for cover. They'll be like, look, we are hitting ISIS. What do you want? Get off our back. We're not just hitting the resistance fighters. It's a chaotic situation, but this thing pales. It's complicated, but this pales in terms of bad news with what's going on in Afghanistan. It seems like people are not paying attention to this, and it smells to me, I could be wrong, like the Taliban are sort of running a knockoff Tet offensive inside of Afghanistan in the run-up to our pullout of that country.
Yeah, absolutely. So the U.S. is down to less than 10,000 troops. They're in a quote-unquote advise and assist mission, basically a training and an advisory mission. Meanwhile, the Taliban took control of the first city in northern Afghanistan. It's the first city to fall since the U.S. has been in Afghanistan in 2001. Mm-hmm. It's a major city, Kunduz. It's a provincial capital, and pretty much other than the 6 out of the 7 districts in that province are now under Taliban control. And they've spread out to other areas. So it looks like the Afghan security forces are collapsing up in the north. They're trying to reinforce, but they're getting beat back on the roads, province south of Kunduz. It's really ugly. look, I said all along the Afghan forces were not ready. Look, the Taliban fought U.S. forces went toe-to-toe with U.S. forces from 2001 to 2013. And, people always said, oh, they can't defeat us. And one of the things I've always said is it's not because they're trying to fight to beat us. They're trying to fight to beat what we're leaving behind. So they trained against the A team to fight the B team. Mm-hmm. And or maybe the C team in the case of the Afghan military. So that's the situation we have going on there. We could perhaps see another provincial capital in the neighboring Baghlan or Balkh province may fall. And then the Afghans are overextended. They're trying to defend the south, the north, the east. And once the north goes, those forces that are deployed in the south and the east are going to try and retake that, leaving wide gaping holes for the Taliban to resurge in areas where U.S. troops were dying just 2 years ago.
So the significance of Kunduz, just so people understand, is that this is the northern part of Afghanistan. This was the part of the country that was stable, quote unquote, that we had control over, and now they've punched a hole right in that.
Exactly, yes. Nobody expected, this is one of the things I warned about with the surge strategy was, what the Petraeus and the Obama administration's surge strategy was, we'll beat the Taliban in the south and Helmand and Kandahar provinces, and we really will basically half-ass the rest of the place. Well, the Taliban said, fine, we'll melt away in the south and we'll start fighting you up in the north, and that's what they did. And it's come to this. And, I warned that this strategy was under-resourced. It was not an over-encompassing strategy. It was only focusing on small parts of the country when the Taliban were a systemic problem. And, this is one of those times where you just hate to be right.
Now, I want to give some credit because, this is a show based in San Diego. We are at 760 KFMB in San Diego. We have got a very proud special operators community here. You know full well the great stuff that these men and women do, especially our special operators here. U.S. Special Forces did engage the Taliban in fighting in Kunduz, but they didn't just rely on the Afghan fighters to get this done. We pitched in, and I understand we did a pretty good job at the airport.
Yeah, so the Taliban, after they took the city, they marched south and from other directions and tried to take on the airport, which is in the outskirts of the city. According to reports, and I can't confirm this, about 100 special operations troops were engaged in the fighting, probably calling in airstrikes and maybe some direct fighting as well. I wouldn't doubt that. And were able to stave off the Taliban from overtaking the airport. Now, the problem is going to become there is if they can't reinforce from the ground, it's going to be an air bridge, and we'll see if the Taliban's able to pull out some anti-aircraft artillery or maybe even get his hands on some surface-to-air missiles and whatnot. U.S. planes are going to be very hesitant to fly in to into an isolated air base like this that's surrounded by its enemies. So it can get pretty dicey up there, and I really, really hope those special operations troops that are up in Kunduz have a good exit plan.
All right, final question for you, and it goes to the front pages, the headlines of the newspaper that we've been reading about for the last couple of weeks, although it's been a problem that's been ongoing since the earliest days of the missions inside of Afghanistan, and that's the saga of these two Green Berets who've been dismissed from the Army because they stood up in defense of these kids that were being sexually abused on U.S. Army bases, on military bases in Afghanistan, because our guys believe in saying something when they see something wrong being done. The official policy out of the Pentagon was basically, hey, it's a cultural difference. Don't get involved. I mean, what about that impact, man? I mean, that is just bad news all the way around.
Yeah, it's demoralizing. Look, there's certain things in that you could ignore culturally. Maybe, the covering the face with the headscarf, right, or skimming money and, some minor criminal activity. But raping children really isn't a cultural difference. That's something. Look, this is what's unknown. The Taliban gained traction by standing up to just that sort of thing. So it was one of the things that helped catapult them into power by taking on warlords who were abusing young boys, taking them from their families and sexually assaulting and raping them. So this should be something that any U.S. service member should object to, and being dismissed for this, it's absolutely disgraceful. I mean, this is an administration and a Defense Department that tells you, you should accept gays, lesbians, and bisexuals and whatnot. And that, hey, whatever, the policy is the policy. If we should accept that, then does that mean we should accept sexually assaulting people? I mean, what does it come to?
Well, you did have, Ash Carter today, on the day that the Russians are running military ops right next to our guys in Syria, did come out and talk about staffing levels and budgets and bringing women into combat troops, into combat units today, alongside, by the way, mentioning the Syrian operation. So obviously political correctness is run completely amok inside the Defense Department, as it does in every other agency.
Yeah, absolutely. I see this come across. I mean, it's really tone deaf. You might want to take that out of the briefing on a day like today or, weekly. I remember State Department has a knack for this as well. You'll get like an update on the, Ugandan National Women's Day or something. And meanwhile, 100 people were killed in a suicide attack and 2 cities were overrun in Iraq.
It's unbelievable.
I mean, you just going, what are you guys thinking here?
Come on, you got it right. Keep your mind on the mission. All right, Bill Raggio from the Long War Journal, folks. You can go to longwarjournal.org. Also follow Bill on Twitter @Bill Raggio. Thanks for coming by, man. And I have a feeling we'll be talking a lot about this in the days and weeks to come.